It's Sunday, April 9, 2023. I'm Anthony Davis. Welcome to the Weekend Show, where we take a deep dive into the news of the week. You can subscribe to my work and get exclusive access to bonus content, live Q&As, and more at patreon.com/5minutenews. Joining us today is Shannon Watts, the founder of Mums Demand Action and author of Fight Like a Mother, How a Grassroots Movement Took on the Gun Lobby and Why Women Will Change the World. Shannon, welcome to the Weekend Show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
On March 28, we saw the murder of 3 children and 3 adults at the Covenant School in Tennessee by a former student. Police named the young victims as Evelyn Deekhouse, Hallie Scruggs, and William Kinney, all aged 9. This is just the latest school shooting here in the US, which has caused a drama now with 2 state lawmakers being expelled over their gun safety protests. Let's go back to 2012, if we can, and remember the 14th of December, when a gunman opened fire in Sandy Hook School in Newton, Connecticut, killing 26 children and educators. Well, the next day, you started a Facebook group to unite women against the gun lobby. Just tell us about that moment, please.
I was a stay-at-home mom of 5 kids, ranging in age from elementary school all the way to college. And I had taken a 5-year break from my career in corporate communications to blend my family with my husband's, our second marriages. And I was just getting ready to go back to work, look for a job, when on December 14th of 2012, I was folding laundry in my bedroom of my home in Indiana. And I saw breaking news that there was a gunman in a school, as you said, in Newtown, Connecticut. And I just sort of sat on the side of my bed and watched this tragedy unfold for hours. And it was just, unfathomable at the time that 20 children and 6 educators would be slaughtered in the sanctity of an American elementary school. And like most Americans, I went to bed in tears and just absolutely devastated. And then I woke up the next day and I was so angry. And I was just to the point of being agitated. I didn't know what to do with all this rage. And I thought, when I was a teen growing up in the 80s, Mothers Against Drunk Driving was such an influential organization to me. And really, women are who have been at the forefront of any kind of major change in this country, right? All the way from prohibition up to the water crisis in Flint, Michigan. And so I thought, okay, there has to be an organization that already exists, like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, but for gun safety. And when I went online, what I found were mostly think tanks run by men, some one-off city and state organizations, again, mostly run by men. And I knew I wanted to be part of a badass army of women. So I started a Facebook page. I had 75 Facebook friends at the time. I was not on Twitter. And I just thought I was starting a conversation about the need for women to rise up against the gun lobby. And of course, women, being the forces of nature they are, turned it into the largest grassroots movement in the country.
It's so interesting, isn't it? For those of us who are parents, and I have 2 kids in elementary school, and I moved from a country that had no guns. One school shooting years ago, they banned guns the next day, practically. That was Dunblane, and then there was never another event like it in the UK. And I moved and brought up my children in a country where school shootings are a regular occurrence and mass shootings are a weekly or daily event, effectively. And the statistic that bothered me the most recently, which is I know one that you have mentioned many, many times in your campaign, is that statistically now guns are the number 1 killer of children and teens in America.
Yes, that's right. So, this crisis in this country, and it's pretty intuitive, right? The fact that if you have 400 million guns and in the hands of civilians, and you have very weak gun laws, that this will become an increasing crisis. Now, what the other side wants us to believe is that somehow more guns make us more safe. If 400 million guns and weak gun laws made us safer, we would be the safest nation in the world. And instead, we have a 26 times higher gun homicide rate than any peer nation. And so it isn't surprising that we are seeing gun violence and gun death increase, particularly in those states, red states, that have weakened their gun laws. And as you said, guns are now the leading cause of death among children and teens in America, everything from suicide to homicide to unintentional shootings. This is all preventable. This is all absolutely senseless. But something we also have that no other peer nation has is a gun lobby and gun makers who have essentially been given a seat at the table to help write our gun laws. And of course, they are not going to write those laws to protect public safety. They're going to write them to protect their profits.
When you talk about the politics of this, you talk about, school shootings. It can be solved with gun safety or, reduction of certain types of firearms. We know that the studies have been done. But when we talk about who is preventing this, you refer to the other side. Is it really as simple as the fact that Republicans are all about school shootings and don't seem to have an emotional connection to the death of children in the same way that Democrats do? I mean, is it as cut and dry as that? Because, as a European looking at this, from my perspective, I just cannot understand how an entire political movement, in terms of the Republicans, can overlook this fact that the lives of children are lost in the process of, for them keeping something that is dear to them, but only in kind of name only.
It is incredibly complicated, and it is an issue with a very long history. If you go back to the early 70s, the NRA was essentially a sports organization, right? So they were about hunting and fishing and even gun safety. That is not who they are anymore. They became radicalized in the late 70s. They became an organization that was focused actually on lobbying. And they've gone more and more to the right. And that's because they've been pulled to the right by other gun groups, national and state-based. So pretty much any state you live in this country has a gun lobbying organization that is to the right of the NRA. It's kind of how the Tea Party pulled the Congress to the right in the 90s. And so if you go back to, for example, 1999, the NRA and gun makers actually supported a background check on every gun sale. They opposed guns in schools. That's all for the watching on YouTube. But as they got pulled more and more to the right, and as they realized the demographic that they were selling guns to, mostly white men over the age of 50 or 60 in this country, as they realized that demographic was dying out, that doesn't sound very gentle, but that's the truth of it, that they would need to sell more guns to more people. And the only way to do that was to become more extreme and to oppose any gun laws whatsoever. And that's where we've gotten to this place where so many Republicans feel beholden to the gun lobby because they used their power and their wealth to essentially make Republicans feel afraid that they would be primaried in any election they ran in, right, by someone who's to the right of them on this issue. If you go back to 2013, just a few months after the Sandy Hook school shooting, there was a bill put forward. It was a bipartisan piece of legislation that would have closed the background check loophole in this country, right? You have to have a background check on licensed sales, but you do not have to have them if you don't have to perform them if you are an unlicensed seller. And that's how millions and millions of guns are sold every year in this country. So this legislation failed. And the reason it failed by just a handful of votes in the Senate was even some Democrats voted against it because they were so afraid of the NRA. And Republicans were so afraid of the NRA. And what did the NRA do after that bill failed? They didn't go back in and support the Democrats who voted with them. They actually opposed them and poured millions of dollars into their Republican counterparts' campaigns. And that was really a turning point because Democrats realized, with friends like the NRA, who needs enemies, and it even made Republicans more afraid of their power. Now, a decade later, not a single Democrat in Congress has an A rating from the NRA. About a quarter of them did back in 2012. That's a seismic shift in American politics. And we're even starting to see more and more Republicans peel away from the gun lobby. But this is a many-year process to really release finger by finger the stranglehold that the gun lobby has on our lawmakers.
The NRA and their kind of evil leader, Wayne LaPierre, who, I mean, really fits the description of somebody who has no emotional connection with love and life and loss and all of the kind of human feelings that we would have as parents and as family members of children who even just go to school with that risk, knowing that something might happen. I just, I cannot get into the mind of that guy. I listen to him speak and I'm just like, there is a total... I mean, it's not that he denies that it's happening, but he has an answer and an excuse for everything, doesn't he? He kind of uses a certain type of language where he gives the impression that, oh, yes, no, I'm listening and we are making changes. But of course he's not. And, he has benefited personally, become very wealthy. There's been controversy about his use of NRA funds. And of course there was that kind of bankruptcy period as well. And despite all of this, there doesn't seem to be really a dent in the NRA's hold over Republicans, some of whom are people that you would have thought would be quite open to this type of, understanding the emotional cost here. People like Mitt Romney, for example.
Yeah, I will never understand how anyone who sides with the NRA or takes money from the NRA sleeps at night, personally. Because these policies have a clear through line. I mean, data proves that weak gun laws lead to more gun violence and more gun death. So personally, I don't understand it except to look at the corruption. The NRA does not and has really never operated like the nonprofit they claim to be. As you mentioned, Wayne LaPierre has received millions and millions of dollars in his role as the CEO of that organization. He has been investigated for using that nonprofit funding to supplement his wardrobe, to pay for personal travel and vacations. He once tried to buy a home after the Parkland shooting tragedy to protect him, ironically. And so if you look at the NRA, it's very clear that the way they operate is, there's a corrupt special interest that is profiting from these gun laws that are killing Americans. I would push back a little bit on this idea that Republicans aren't beginning to evolve on this issue. Certainly, there are gun extremists that have been elected to state legislatures. There are gun extremists in the U.S. Senate. There are some that are simply cowardly. People like Lindsey Graham and, as you mentioned, Mitt Romney, people who know exactly what they're doing. They know it's wrong. And yet they can't risk, losing their jobs or losing the money or the power or the support that they've had from gun makers for the last several decades. That is beginning to change. I think people get so frustrated by incremental change, and I understand that. But the way the system is set up, the way democracy works, is that it is not an overnight process. I wish that it were. I would not have been a full-time volunteer for the last decade. I would have been doing other things with my life. But it became very clear to us when that bill I mentioned earlier, the Manchin-Toomey bill, failed, that Congress is not where this work begins, it's where it ends. And that we would need to go into school boards and city councils and state houses. And we would need to work on this issue culturally, legislatively, electorally. And that was how change was made, and that incrementalism does actually lead to revolutions. And once you have that kind of momentum, you will see people like Mitt Romney finally do the right thing. I personally don't care if Republicans do the right thing because they've had a change of heart or mind, or because it's politically expedient. We just need them to do it.
Mums Demand Action has a kind of slightly different tactic for kind of getting through to these people, right? Just tell us a little bit about your process. And because I do, and I apologize if I gave the impression that there wasn't change, because I know that there are so many people campaigning, and of course there is. But, ultimately, banning these semi-automatic rifles would be the first and most obvious way of reducing the numbers of children who die in these shootings, because these weapons are used the most. But just explain about what it is that the organization is doing and how it goes about that.
Sure. We actually prioritize background checks because when you look at the data, it is the foundation of any gun safety system. And it is what keeps guns out of the hands of dangerous people or people who are a risk to themselves or others, like minors. And so background checks is first and foremost our priority. We need that at a federal level. We are all only as safe as the closest state with the weakest gun laws. However, we have done that work state by state. We've now passed background check laws in 20 states. Unfortunately, what the NRA is working to pass is something called permitless carry. That is a law that allows people to carry hidden loaded handguns in public with no background check and no safety training. They have now passed those laws in 21 states, and they're currently working to pass that in Florida. So you really have this interesting dichotomy of blue states with strong laws, including background checks, and very many red states with incredibly weak laws and absolutely no background check required whatsoever. And the data is very clear, right? These red states have more gun violence and more gun death. Blue states have less gun violence and less gun death. So background checks are a priority for us. Disarming domestic abusers. We've now passed laws in 29 states that go further than federal law and prevent anyone who has been convicted of domestic abuse, including misdemeanors, of having access to guns. We pass secure storage laws in states, which essentially requires adults to keep their guns locked, unloaded, separate from ammunition. And then, yes, we have also passed assault weapon bans and magazine limits. I want to make sure people understand that mass shootings and school shootings are about 1% of the gun violence in this country. The daily gun violence that kills 110 people, wounds hundreds more, is mostly carried out with handguns. It's mostly in our communities. It's gun homicide, which disproportionately impacts Black and brown communities. It's also gun suicide, which is typically in rural areas, but now more and more common among children and teens all over the country. This is a complex issue, gun violence. It requires holistic solutions and not just laws, right? We are also unlocking hundreds of millions of dollars for community violence intervention programs. Those are programs where people are trained to stop retaliatory gun violence before it can happen. And then we also work on this issue, as I mentioned, electorally. So we get involved in every single election cycle to vote for or support what we call gun sense candidates. Our own volunteers are running for office. 140 ran in November and won at all levels of government. And then culturally, we talk a lot about secure storage, teaching people how to ask about how guns are stored when they send their kids to families and friends' homes, and getting celebrities and influencers and athletes and others to speak out on this issue. It is going to require addressing it on all fronts. And I think we've done a pretty good job of that for the last decade.
I think it was by the end of last month, there was over 100 mass shootings in the US. That's just the first 3 months of the year. And as we said earlier, this doesn't happen in any equivalent country anywhere in the world. And do you think Americans really understand, considering that, America is such a huge place, and if you want to take a vacation, you don't really have to leave the country. There's so many different places to visit and different landscapes, different climates within the US. And I think that's part of the reason why people don't travel, right? But when you don't travel, you don't get a sense of how other countries do it differently. I mean, I'm from a country where the police don't even carry guns. And my American friends cannot understand that. They just think it's insane. But it's a little bit like smoking. You never have to try and work hard to give up smoking if you never started in the first place. And unfortunately in the US, the horse has bolted. So getting that genie back in the bottle is an impossible task. But do you think that enough people understand the difference between the US and the rest of the world where this doesn't happen?
I mean, I think what you're saying is right, in terms of being provincial and really just being focused on the United States. And I do think we have a culture here, a culture of violence that goes all the way back to slavery, and that a lot of what we're talking about is based in systemic racism in this country. Um, the horse is out of the barn, as you said. We have 400 million guns in this country. The idea that somehow we're going to put that genie back in the bottle is unlikely. That said, there are peer nations that have high rates of gun ownership, but low rates of gun violence. And that is because they have extremely strong gun laws. I mean, people always say, well, look at Illinois and look at California. They have the strongest gun laws in the country, and yet they still have gun violence. And yes, they're strong compared to the rest of America, but they're not strong, as you said, compared to nations in Europe, or even countries like Japan. And so when you look at, again, blue states that have strong gun laws, the data is in. The data directs us in the right way to go on passing stronger gun laws, background checks, disarming domestic abusers, secure storage, on and on. The question is when we will reach a tipping point where Republicans finally feel like they will be held accountable if they continue to make laws based on rhetoric and anecdote and fake data from so-called gun lobby researchers, who are not credible in any way. Anecdotally, I will tell you that I was in Missouri recently, and we have 4 volunteers who were elected to office there, and they were saying that they'd been knocking doors in November, and prior to the election, they would knock on the door of rural Republicans. And those Republicans would say to them, I am going to let you put your signs, they were Democrats, in my yard because I am so afraid that my kids aren't safe in their schools. And I do believe we will get to a place where Republicans will be held accountable and they will no longer be able to make policy based in lies. Time is of the essence with 110 people shot and killed every day, obviously, but that time is coming. And we're seeing it happen. We're seeing that shift happen, but we still have, again, what no other peer nation has. That is a gun lobby that's allowed to help make gun laws. And it's also, frankly, just this easy access to guns. And we know that is what is causing our gun violence crisis.
There is this discrepancy in the US, not just with kind of gun law, but plenty of other laws as well. Abortion is one of them, where the elected representatives' view does not reflect the view of their constituents or of the wider country. And so I have no doubt, because we've spoken so far about politicians, right? But as you say, in terms of parents, there can't be a single parent who sends their child to school who is happy about the status quo in terms of school shootings and gun laws and gun ownership. And I'm sure if you press parents, they will have a very different view to, say, their governor if they happen to be living in a red state. So how do we kind of cross that Rubicon of getting the people, Republicans and Democrats, to be more vocal about how they feel about gun safety and leave the politicians out of it? Is that a kind of way to do this, to make it more about the voices on the street rather than just the voices in Washington?
Well, I mean, I think Florida is a good example of this. Right now, Governor DeSantis is trying to pass permitless carry. Polling shows it's not something Floridians want. The law enforcement is hugely opposed. They've testified against it. Even sheriffs, and many sheriffs in this country are conservative because it's an elected position and the NRA has sort of cornered the market on funding their campaigns. Even sheriffs in Florida, many of them are opposed to permitless carry. And yet Republicans are hell-bent on passing this legislation anyway. I think in large part because, this is sort of primary politics, and Governor DeSantis is trying to create a run for the presidency, and he wants to cater to and pander to the Trump base. many of whom are gun extremists. So that is a situation where people on the street, including police officers, are opposed to this extreme law. But they really do, I think, just count on Americans having short attention spans and either not holding them accountable, or because of things like gerrymandering, not being able to hold them accountable.
It's a sorry state of affairs, isn't it, where there is like a gigantic national miscommunication, right, where everybody knows that guns are bad, everybody knows that they kill children and at a far greater rate than in any other country. Everybody knows that as a fact, and yet there is this constitutional issue that a lot of people just fall back on the whole time, where they're just like, well, you're not taking away my guns, this is my Second Amendment right, it says in the Constitution that I'm allowed to do this, but it doesn't say in the Constitution that, you can go and kill children in a school. It doesn't say in the Constitution that you can have a weapon that was designed for the theater of war. How do we deal with this kind of miscommunication that doesn't seem to be, obviously conversations are had, but there must be a better way to kind of market this misinformation.
Well, I think that's the rhetoric of gun extremists. And the NRA has a 30-year head start with that kind of misinformation. The Second Amendment has been perverted. It was never meant to protect the rights of criminals, to enable dangerous people to have easy access to guns, to arm domestic abusers, to pit Americans against one another, and to kill one another. This special interest, right, gun makers have perverted the Second Amendment to create billions of dollars in profit. And as a result, we have this 26 times higher gun homicide rate than any peer nation. So I believe that there will always be this subset of gun extremists who believe that rhetoric, who use that rhetoric. We have the data that shows the rhetoric isn't true, that having easy access to guns makes us all less safe. And so we just really have to create this grassroots army, which we have, that can go toe to toe with the gun lobby, that can hold lawmakers accountable. As I mentioned, we get involved in every single electoral cycle, and we give out something we call a gun sense distinction to candidates, regardless of political party, who are on the right side of this issue. And there used to be a point, as I said, about a quarter of all Democrats had an A rating from the NRA. Today, none do. And they proudly wear their F-rated pins. So this is a cultural change. It doesn't happen overnight, but there will always be gun extremists in this country. That is why we are trying to get Americans, particularly women who are the majority of the voting public, to use their voices and their votes on this issue and to affect change. And that's how we got, frankly, 15 Republicans to vote for the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act last summer. That was not something we imagined would happen just a decade in.
I want to talk about women and men on this subject because obviously that's a big part of your campaign. But it also plays into this kind of gender stereotypes. It plays into the fact that the reality that most of these mass shootings, most of the school shootings, most of anything to do with firearms involves the boys and not the girls. The girls are the victims. The boys are the ones doing the shooting. It's very, obviously I'm a guy, so but I'm also vehemently against gun ownership. But I recognize that I'm living in a country that has a culture, as you say, that goes right back to the Wild West. Let's just talk about this kind of this gender issue here. If we eradicated all the boys, if we could wave a magic wand, then there wouldn't be any school shootings. There probably wouldn't be any wars either in foreign nations. What do you say about that aspect of it, and why is it so important that women drive this message home?
Well, first of all, it is complicated, right? So most shooters are men, particularly mass shooters. Most victims of gun homicide are Black and brown men. Most victims of gun suicide are white men. But domestic gun violence, most victims are women. And incidents of domestic violence are the majority of triggers for mass shootings. So it is complicated. All that said, I felt when I started Moms Demand Action that women played a really important role. Whether we like it or not, I certainly wouldn't argue that it's not anachronistic, but women are seen, mothers are seen as the caretakers of their families and their communities. And I had a conversation with a feminist named Soraya Shamali. She wrote the book, Rage Becomes Her. And she was talking about how women have to be pragmatic and that we have to use the levers of power that are available to us. We only hold about 25% of the 500,000 elected positions in this country. We're less than 5% of Fortune 1000 CEOs. So we aren't making the policies and the laws that protect our families and communities, but we are the majority of the voting public. We're the majority of the nation's population. And, we have a lot of political power as swing voters. And so using that power, harnessing that power, getting women educated and showing them how to be activists and to make a difference, creating a brand that makes women feel like they could take on the most powerful, wealthy special interest that ever existed and win, that was something I bet on early on that would be effective and that could succeed. And I was right. Type A, brilliant, amazing, sophisticated women all across this country have taken the idea I had and made it bigger and more amazing than I ever imagined. I also want to be clear, we stand on the shoulders of Black women who have been doing this work in their communities for decades, really invisibly because they don't get covered by the media. But finally, I think we have an organization in this country where women from all walks of life, Black, brown, white, feel empowered and committed to working together to take on the gun lobby, to take on lawmakers who aren't doing the right thing, and understanding that this has to last into perpetuity, that as long as there is this special interest, there will be a need for us to protect the wins we have and to continue pushing so that all lawmakers are on the right side of this issue.
We're going to take a quick pause so I can talk about today's sponsor, and then we'll come back with more with Shannon Watts. Today's show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Getting to know yourself can be a lifelong process, especially because we're always growing and changing. The last few years especially have been a wild ride filled with my own personal self-realizations and growth. Therapy is all about deepening your self-awareness and understanding, because sometimes we don't know what we want or why we react the way we do until we talk things through. BetterHelp connects you with a licensed therapist who can take you on that journey of self-discovery from wherever you are. I personally have benefited directly from therapy, allowing myself to talk through and work through experiences in my past that were unknowingly having a major impact on the way I go about my day. Therapy is an incredibly helpful tool for learning positive coping skills and how to set boundaries. Over time, I've truly learned to become the best version of myself. And look, therapy is for everyone, not just for people who've experienced major trauma, because what you're working through matters. Never discount that. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Discover your potential with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/weekendshow today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/weekendshow. Cold turkey may be great on sandwiches, but there's a better way to break your bad habits. We're not talking about some weird mind voodoo from your wacky neighbor or some sketchy message board. We're talking about our sponsor, Fume, and they look at the problem in a different way. Not everything in a bad habit is wrong, so instead of a drastic, uncomfortable change, why not just remove the bad from your habit? Fume is an innovative, award-nominated device that does just that. Instead of electronics, Fume is completely natural. Instead of vapor, Fume uses flavored air. And instead of harmful chemicals, Fume uses all natural, delicious flavors. You get it. Instead of bad, fume is good. It's a habit you're free to enjoy and makes replacing your bad habit easy. Your fume comes with an adjustable airflow dial that is designed with movable parts and magnets for fidgeting, giving your fingers a lot to do, which is helpful for de-stressing and anxiety while breaking your habit. I gave a fume to my sister, and she was shocked at how flavorful and fresh it tasted. It's easy to hold and perfectly balanced and, quite honestly, extremely fun to fidget with. The real wood material and sleek design definitely classes it up, and she feels pretty cool holding it. Stopping is something we all put off because it's hard, but switching to fume is easy, enjoyable, and even fun. Fume has served over 100,000 customers and has thousands of success stories, and there's no reason that can't be you. Join Fume in accelerating humanity's breakup from destructive habits by picking up the Journey Pack today. Head to tryfume.com and use code WEEKEND to save 10% off when you get the Journey Pack today. That's tryfum.com and use code WEEKEND to save an additional 10% off your order today. Shannon Watts of Mums Demand Action. Do you think the value of life in the US has kind of less currency than in other countries? Because this is how I feel with all of these conversations. And, you know, I've interviewed Ryan Bussey a couple of times, who's a former gun executive who's, you know, turned his back on the industry and has kind of exposed a lot of their tactics. And I asked him a similar question, because civility is a word that comes up a lot for me anyway. I feel that, you know, America has always been kind of uncivilized just by nature of its history. You mentioned slavery earlier, and obviously racism, which is embedded very much in the fabric of even conversations about gun crime. It gets into the kind of pores of every major issue in the US. But, you know, hopefully we're becoming more civilized and not less civilized, and the value of life is increasing, not decreasing. What do you think about that?
I think it's so complicated. I think you're right when you talk about America's history being uniquely violent and racist, and certainly that contributes to our gun violence crisis because of laws, for example, like Stand Your Ground, right, which we know disproportionately impact Black and brown people, essentially gives people the right to shoot someone else without asking any kind of question, assuming that they are in the right. That makes everyday altercations, like everyone has, right, in every nation, it turns them deadly. Because when you have a gun, you know, as the saying goes, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I think the same can be said about having a firearm. And data bears that out. But, you know, every time there's a mass shooting in this country or a high-profile shooting, you will always hear the same thing, particularly from media, which is this idea that somehow we are numb to gun violence. Having done this work now for over 11 years and interacting all the time with parents, particularly women across the country, I've never met a parent who said, you know what, this is just the way it is, and I accept it. And I am going to send my kids to school, and I'm not sure they're going to come home. I just don't think that is a real thing. I do think we're traumatized in this country. I think when you can't turn on the news and see horrific incidences of gun violence in your community all day, every day, and not feel that trauma, that secondhand trauma, I think that's what we mistake sometimes for numbness. And I think that's a very uniquely American issue, where we have to fight to get people to understand that they can make a difference, right? That if they get involved, that there's strength in numbers, and that is so incredibly important not to tune out, and to not ignore the issue or to expect that other people are going to do the work for you. I go back to what you said about, like, do we value life? And, you know, it's these same conservative lawmakers who say that they're pro-life, right? Who are passing these anti-abortion laws and who are going after trans kids and gay kids. and who are increasing the risk of maternal death through the laws they're passing. And yet they're perfectly fine, with easy access to guns. I saw today in Utah that they are going to prevent kids from under 18 from having access to social media, yet they have easy access to guns. I don't understand how they're able to justify those two ways of thinking, except to say the Second Amendment has somehow, with gun extremists, become synonymous now with Christianity and with patriotism, and this MAGA idea that having a gun is this American obligation.
Well, they've been lied to, haven't they? I mean, that's what this boils down to, because none of those things are based in truth.
Right.
Like trying to prevent trans people from being part of society, or trying to prevent women from having access to women's healthcare. I mean, none of that is it's inhumane, aside from being uncivil. And so they've been lied to by, as you say, the kind of that MAGA movement that have weaponized patriotism and freedom and all of those things. We can all be patriotic. We all are patriotic, hopefully. We are all free. But freedom is not going to school and not knowing if you're going to come home, right?
I mean, that is the opposite of freedom, right? This idea that America is based on the principle of freedom, and yet we don't feel like we are safe in our communities, on the streets, in our movie theaters, in our schools, in our libraries, and on and on and on. I mean, that's the opposite of freedom. And we're sort of being held hostage, right, by the gun lobby.
I'm naive, Shannon, and please, you're welcome to kind of say otherwise, but I think most people are inherently born good, right? I think that there's the nature and nurture debate, but I think we are born good, and our exposure through our parents, through our education and our experience is what makes us or breaks us. And so I give people the benefit of the doubt that people are good. But when we talk about these lawmakers who choose money over lives, when we talk about gun makers, I mean, how many more guns do you need to sell? You already made your money. How much money do you need to spend?
Well,
I mean, is it that these people are just evil? Is that what it is? Is that they're actually not all born, or they're born good, but they have been led astray?
I think the latter. I think money corrupts, right? Money and power corrupts. They know what they're doing is wrong, many of them, or they have seriously drunk the Kool-Aid. And I've met many of those lawmakers, particularly in state houses, who truly believe this misinformation, who truly believe the rhetoric. But I also think, as we talked about before, it's sort of full circle, this idea of there is misogyny and racism and bigotry that is involved in these laws. And also, we talked about the vast majority of lawmakers in this country are men. Most of them are white men. And I do think there is something to be said about they're afraid of ceding their power. And one way to keep a control on power against women and trans and gay people and Black people is through intimidation, right? There's a reason we're seeing more and more men show up with semi-automatic rifles at state houses and at protests, and when racist monuments are even being torn down. This is all intrinsically aligned. And they
almost think they're doing good, don't they? I mean, that's the thing. It's not that they know they're doing bad. They think they're doing good. It's almost like they've had to talk themselves into the story because, the power and the riches is more important, and it blinds them. It's almost like becomes like a mental health issue. It's being brainwashed.
Well, I mean, I think that's going back to this MAGA cultish idea, right? I mean, if you had told me that someone like Kyle Rittenhouse would be considered a hero for taking a gun to a rally, where people are exercising the First Amendment and gunning down people who thought he was an active shooter and they were trying to protect themselves. I mean, this person has been made a hero by the gun extremists in this nation. And I can't imagine anything more tragic or pathetic.
They kind of think it's funny, don't they?
Yes.
I mean, that's the thing. They seem to have a sense of humor about this subject. And you and I as parents, let alone the people that have actually directly lost family to gun violence, whether in school or otherwise, there is nothing amusing about this. I mean, you can't even make... There is no joy in this at all. It is painful and it is tragic. And yet Kyle Rittenhouse kind of had a smile on his face throughout all of this.
Well, and he's been made famous and will probably be made wealthy by this. But what you remind me of is a few years ago, I went and was sitting in the state legislature in New Hampshire. I just happened to be there on this day. And our survivors were testifying in favor of gun safety legislation. And all of the Republican members who were on the committee hearing panel, including the men, were wearing pearl necklaces. And I couldn't figure out why were they wearing these pearl necklaces. And turns out the reason they wore them was because they were saying that we were clutching our pearls, right, around gun issues. They're doing this to survivors of gun violence. And this idea that somehow it's funny. I mean, it's cruel.
I mean, even wearing the pin of the
Yes.
of the rifle, which I've seen in Congress recently, several of the Republicans have been wearing that. I mean, that really is a knife in the back of anybody who has tried to bring legislation or save lives.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
it's unfathomable to me. I mean, and I think part of that is my European perspective, but it's also my perspective as a parent, which we share. I just want to talk about a Congressman, Maxwell Frost, a black Central Florida congressman who made a speech recently in Congress that was very, very powerful. It was really the first time I'd seen somebody who needed to be saying this stuff use such explicit language. Did you see that? And how did you feel about that speech?
Yeah, I mean, I'm so grateful that Maxwell Congressman Frost was elected. It's so important to have the next generation in Congress. I would just say that, Lucy McBath should also get an acknowledgement here. Lucy was a Moms Demand Action volunteer, a gun violence survivor. Her 17-year-old son, Jordan Davis, was shot and killed by a white man who said his music was too loud. Jordan was a black teen. And Lucy became a volunteer. She had been a flight attendant. Then she became a spokesperson. And then she ran for a seat in Congress held for 30 years by Republicans. It's Newt Gingrich's old seat. She won that election and has won 3 times since. And I really think she is sort of the role model for Congressman Frost. The first thing Lucy did was to pass stronger gun laws in 2018 through the House. Look, I think it is incredibly important that we elect survivors and gun safety advocates to office at all levels, because that is really how you play the inside game and the long game. We have noticed that when we train our volunteers to become advocates, they sort of intuitively want to become lawmakers. You spend a lot of time in a state house and you realize these are not rocket scientists, many of them. They don't maybe know as much about the issue as you do. They don't care as much about the issue as you do. And I think that electing people like Congressman Frost, Congresswoman Lucy McBath, and so many others in the last several years, it's really key to changing the culture around this issue.
I want to talk about 2 things. Firstly is the phrase thoughts and prayers, which is something, for those who don't know or those outside the US who aren't familiar with the term, has become a kind of catch-all phrase that appears in tweets and in statements made invariably by Republicans, because it just like that's as far as they're going to go.
Yeah.
A mass shooting happens, children get massacred, thoughts and prayers. Doesn't include any detail, doesn't make any specific promises, doesn't really even say that much, does it? Thoughts and prayers. I mean, we could do that every day about anything. Just talk about the kind of significance or possibly the insignificance of that language and why it's so frustrating when you hear it.
Yeah, I mean, it's become a meme, right? It is not something that is taken seriously anymore. We started seeing this after the Sandy Hook school shooting tragedy, where lawmakers would offer their thoughts and prayers without any action whatsoever. I get the prayers piece. I'm not sure what the thoughts means, but either of those things without action are pretty meaningless. These people are in power to make laws. You know, if they don't believe laws work, they've probably picked the wrong line of business. We aren't electing them for their thoughts or for their prayers. And so we started pointing that out because we just saw it over and over again. Most lawmakers are now too embarrassed to use those words because they will be ridiculed online, rightly. And I think it's an important way for us to point out that, you know, if thoughts and prayers worked, we wouldn't keep having rising levels of gun violence in this country. And so I just think, you know, it's become a joke. And anyone who uses that phrase really is sort of becomes a laughingstock on Twitter very quickly.
Because there seems to be, apart from that phrase, there seems to be kind of zero engagement. And so even if there is a debate, Republicans will come to the table with a very closed mind. And now hopefully there are a few anomalies to this. I don't want to tar everyone with the same brush. But the rhetoric that has been spun is that Democrats want to take away your guns, which is not true, right? There is no basis in truth at all with that. And I respectfully understand the United States, and I wouldn't, as a British person, for a second suggest that Americans should have their guns taken away. But it would be an obvious thing for every gun owner in the US to want to be background checked, to want to have a secure place to store their firearms, to want to have training on how to use them properly so they don't accidentally shoot themselves. I mean, this is just common sense. And yet there is this miscommunication once again where the marketing of Democrats want to take away your guns is much louder than the detail and the reality, which actually most civil, level-headed people would agree with.
I actually don't think, and this is based on my experience in the last decade, I actually don't think that idea of Democrats want to take your guns resonates anymore. I think people think, especially after, you know, many years of a Democratic administration, Obama and then Biden, and that not happening, like that just, I don't think people can say that seriously. But what we do see, again, is this idea of gun extremists dragging the party to the right, where it's not about Democrats taking their guns away anymore. It's about wanting to have unfettered access to guns, right? So somehow a background check is a constitutional infringement, or having to pay for safety training, or making safety training mandatory. I mean, we just saw the Fifth Circuit rule that domestic abusers should have access to guns, right? That's because these extremists have been nominated, appointed by the president, Donald Trump, former President Donald Trump. So I actually think what we're seeing is more and more of this extremism, that guns for the right wing have become an organizing principle. So, you know, going back 10 years ago, our bet was shine a light on the NRA, show how corrupt they are, and you will win. And we, I think, essentially have put the NRA out of business, right? They're hemorrhaging political power and money. They didn't have a seat at the table when the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act passed, and Mitch McConnell whipped the votes in favor of it, right? So we did that. What we did not bet on was that guns would become an organizing principle for the right, that it would become something that enabled extremists to get new members in the door for these extremist groups, that it would generate millions and millions of dollars for them, and that guns would excite the base on a whole host of issues, right? Not just guns, but also anti-abortion, anti-trans, anti-women, and on and on. And so I think that's where we are right now, which is we're stuck in this situation where the right has become so right and so entrenched that they have the power in too many places, and we have to fix that.
I guess what you're describing is extremism.
Yes.
And extremism comes in many different forms. And we used to think of an extremist as being, I don't know, a jihadi, right? But now it's very much domestic terrorism. It's very much the majority of the Republican Party. And when you have people like Lauren Boebert, I mean, she used to own Shooter's Grill, for goodness sake. You know, I mean, it's very hard to make any inroads when you've got people like that actually in the very center, you know, at the very nucleus of the Republican Party. And as we know, for Kevin McCarthy to get the speakership, he had to really sell his soul to the devil, or Marjorie Taylor Greene. The two, I guess, are interchangeable. Finally, I want to talk about mental health, because this is often used as an excuse by the right that the mental problems, I'm just using Donald Trump language now, that the mental problems of the shooter is where it starts and where it stops. It's nothing to do with the gun. It's all to do with the person with the gun, and we need good guys with guns to stop bad guys with guns. I mean, all this garbage doesn't make any sense. Like, it's just moronic. And yet they stick with this, and it gets repeated and it gets shared, and before you know it, people start to believe that that's really the truth of the situation. So let's talk about finally how mental health has been kind of weaponized as an excuse to kind of do nothing about gun safety.
There's so many straw men. Certainly mental health is one of them. At one point, I was keeping online a record of all the things Republicans blamed mass shootings on, and it was everything from mental illness to video games to Adderall to not enough exit doors to too many exit doors to single parenting. I mean, the list is long and bizarre. But mental health is one that comes up over and over again. Of course, the irony here is that Republicans constantly veto funding for mental illness programs and then blame it each time there's a mass shooting. If they really thought this was the cause that could be addressed, I would think they would support funding for it. But when you look at the data, we have the same rates in America of mental illness than our peer nations do. What we have, again, is so much more gun homicide and gun suicide because we have such easy access to guns. Mental illness, people who are mentally ill, they are much more likely to be victims of gun violence and not perpetrators. And so we just know based on the data that is an inaccurate reason for any kind of gun violence. Is mental illness an issue in America and in other peer nations? Absolutely. But sadly, it is not the origin of our gun violence crisis. That is easy access to guns.
There were 3 large-scale studies done recently on mass attacks that showed disparities over the influence of mental illness. So you talk about the data, but just anecdotally, I mean, it's, again, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to understand the issues here. And especially when we look at the children who are getting guns or the young people who are getting guns and going into school, there's so much intent. Live streaming it in some cases, being very deliberate about their plan, having body armor and equipment. It's not mental illness when you are absolutely set on becoming famous, even. I mean, this is now another thing, isn't it? The kind of rise of celebrity is so... People are so desperate for that. If a former reality TV star can become the president, then I want to be a star too. And it's so easy to get access to a gun and go cause some horrific incident and then be on the front page of the newspaper. Do you think that plays a part in this kind of idea of celebrity?
Well, data shows that it does. There have been many studies that show that a lot of this started around the time of Columbine. This idea of committing acts of violence in order to attain infamy, whether while they were alive or dead. It's why a survivor of gun violence, of the Aurora shooting, started a campaign called No Notoriety. And that's this idea of let's never name mass shooters. Let's only focus on the victims and the survivors. And, it's interesting. I can't tell you the names of the mass shooters and I do this, right, every day, of the mass shootings in the last 5 years, for the most part. And the reason for that is because of this idea of let's not name the shooter. And people like Anderson Cooper on CNN and others have been really good about following that guideline. Police now understand, you can name the shooter once at the very beginning, and then from then on, refer to them only by the gunman. So I think because of the age of social media, because you can stream things live, that we are going to continue to see this. But it just, again, makes the point, which is there are kids who want to be famous and who are troubled in every nation. But this is only happening in America because we give children easy access to guns.
We have to finish, but I'd love you to tell us a website or a place that people can go to support your campaign, or any further reading that people should do. I mean, what's the next steps for people who have seen you around and are thinking, okay, well, I'd like to be part of this movement?
I do have a book called Fight Like a Mother, and all the proceeds go to gun violence prevention organizations. But also you can find us on Twitter at @MomsDemand. We're on Facebook. We're on Instagram. MomsDemandAction.org is our website. And then if you just want to join, and we're not just moms anymore, we're mothers and others, we're students and survivors, text the word READY to 64433. And a volunteer will call you pretty immediately and let you know how you can plug in where you live. There will always be an event or something you can do virtually. But it goes back to this idea of everyone using their voice and their vote on this issue. Because once we do that, and we hold lawmakers accountable, and we change the culture, and we change the laws in this country, we will save lives.
Shannon Watts, thank you very much for joining us on The Weekend Show.
Thank you.
I'm Anthony Davis. Please subscribe to The Weekend Show on YouTube or as an audio podcast. And also don't forget to visit patreon.com/5Minute News for exclusive Patreon-only videos, bonus content, live Q&A for members. So subscribe for exclusive access. The 5-Minute News Daily Podcast drops every morning, so hear me tell you the day's news, and join me next week with a brand new special guest and 3 more factual news stories to discuss on the 5-Minute News Weekend Show with MeidasTouch.